Before the disappearance made national headlines, before families crowded living rooms praying for a phone call that never came, before investigators stood in disbelief over a car sitting silently in the snow, there was only a routine Friday night. 5 young men from Yuba County, California, laughing, excited, heading home after a college basketball game. 5 friends with simple plans, loyal families, and structured routines that anchored their lives. But sometime between leaving Chico and returning to Yuba City, something happened, something so strange, so sudden, and so disturbing, that it led these men nearly 70 miles in the wrong direction, up a remote and dangerous mountain road. A road they would never normally travel. A road covered in snow, ice, and darkness. A road with no clear destination. And at the end of that road, investigators found their car. An unlocked, undamaged 1969 Mercury Montego, sitting neatly on the side of a forest path. No footprints leading away. No signs of panic. No evidence of an accident. Just a car, waiting. Silent. Cold. Out of place in every possible way. From the moment search crews arrived, nothing made sense. The men inside that car weren't wilderness explorers. They weren't risk takers. They weren't the type to head into the mountains at night, let alone in winter. Their families described them as gentle, dependable, and predictable, men who loved routine and rarely deviated from it. They were supposed to be home that night. They had plans the next morning, plans they were excited about, a Special Olympics basketball tournament where they were expected to play. Their uniforms were laid out. Their mothers had prepared snacks. They even reminded their parents not to let them oversleep. Everything in their lives suggested they would go straight home. Yet there their car sat, 70 miles in the wrong direction, in a place none of them had ever expressed interest in visiting. But the mystery didn't stop at the car. It was only the beginning. As days passed with no sign of the men, hope began slipping away. Families waited by their windows. Mothers left porch lights on all night. Fathers retraced roads again and again, praying for tire tracks that weren't there. Entire communities held their breath, wondering how 5 men could vanish without leaving even a trace in the snow. Then, months later, when the snows finally melted, searchers stumbled upon the next horrifying discovery. 20 miles from the car, through brutal terrain and forest so dense it swallowed sound, stood an abandoned Forest Service trailer. Inside, lying on a bed of thin blankets, was the body of 32-year-old Ted Weiher. What shocked investigators wasn't just that Ted had made it to the trailer, it was how long he survived once he got there. Weeks. Maybe months. He had lost nearly 100 pounds. His beard showed significant growth. His feet were severely frostbitten. And someone, perhaps one of his friends, had tucked him carefully into the bed, wrapping him in layers to keep him warm. Yet inside that same trailer, there were supplies. Food. Heating materials. A propane tank that could have provided warmth. Matches that remained untouched. Why didn't he use them? Why didn't any of them? Over time, the remaining bodies were found, each in different locations, scattered across the mountain as though the group had fragmented, each member trying to survive in his own way. Some made it further than others. Some were found closer to the car. One man, Gary Mathias, was never found at all. To this day, his disappearance remains one of the most debated aspects of the entire case. But the most unsettling element came from witness accounts. People claim to have seen the men alive long after they supposedly vanished. One man swore he saw their green and white car around 11 p.m. A second claimed he saw them in a red pickup truck. And a third man, half frozen himself, reported speaking to the boys that night, but his testimony wasn't heard until months later, when it was too late for investigators to use it. Each witness story contradicted the last. Each account deepened the mystery instead of solving it. What investigators were left with felt impossible. A car that wasn't stuck. A trailer full of supplies that went unused. Bodies found miles apart. A timeline riddled with contradictions. And a group of young men who, by all accounts, should never have been there. Why would they abandon a working car? Why march deeper into the wilderness? Why split up? Why would one survive so long without using what was right in front of him? Every answer leads only to more questions. Every clue creates another contradiction. And every theory, no matter how logical, fails to explain the entire picture. The path the Yuba County Five took that night is still shrouded in mystery. Tonight, we walk through that puzzle piece by piece. Every documented fact. Every verified witness account. Every discovery searchers made in those mountains. This is the unexplained journey of five friends whose routine night turned into one of the most confounding mysteries in American true crime history. Because what investigators uncovered next changed everything. To understand the disappearance of the Yuba County Five, we must first step back into the world these men lived in, California, 1978. A time before cell phones, before GPS, before instant communication. A time when long-distance drives at night meant nothing more than headlights cutting through the dark and the hope that your car behaved itself. Yuba City and Marysville, neighboring towns known together as the Twin Cities, sat quietly in the Sacramento Valley. Nestled between farmland, orchards, and the Sierra Nevada foothills, the region moved at a gentler pace than the bustling cities to the south. Here, Friday nights meant local basketball games, small gatherings, and familiar routines built on reliability and community trust. And within this close-knit environment lived five men whose lives would become the center of one of the strangest true crime mysteries in American history. The group was often called the Boys by friends and family, not out of belittlement, but out of affection. They were gentle, kind, and bonded by shared experiences, routines, and a genuine love for sports, especially basketball. Four of the five were described as having mild intellectual disabilities or emotional challenges, though all were highly functional, social, and capable in their daily lives. Each had unique personalities that complemented the others. There was Jack Madruga, a quiet ex-army man and dependable worker. Bill Sterling, thoughtful and deeply religious. Jack Hewitt, the youngest, cheerful and deeply attached to the group. Ted Weiher, warm-hearted, known for his sense of humor and protectiveness. And Gary Mathias, the most unpredictable of the five, charismatic, sharp, and managing schizophrenia with medication and treatment. Together, they formed a team, literally. They called themselves the Gateway Gators, a nod to the Rehabilitation Center sports program they played for. They weren't just teammates, they were brothers. The group's families often described them as inseparable. They rode together, ate together, planned together. And when they left for Chico that February evening to watch a UC Davis basketball game, everything about their behavior matched their usual routine: excitement, anticipation, and a promise to return home right after. That promise mattered. The next morning was important, not for work, not for an exam, but for something they cherished deeply: the Special Olympics basketball tournament. Their families had prepared their uniforms. Snacks were neatly packed. The boys had discussed the event all week. Some even laid out their clothes in advance. Nothing, absolutely nothing, suggested they would deviate from their path home. But something happened during that hour-long drive home from Chico. Something powerful enough to send them up a desolate mountain road instead of back toward the safety of their homes. To understand the magnitude of that detour, we need to understand the geography. Yuba City lies in the lowlands, flat, mild, comfortable. But drive northeast toward the Sierra Nevada, and the gentle fields give way to dense forests, steep inclines, and isolated mountain paths, especially in winter. The road their car was found on, Oroville-Quincy Road, was not merely a wrong turn. It was remote, treacherous, and partially closed due to snow. Even experienced drivers avoided it at night. Locals knew the risks: the lack of lighting, the sharp drop-offs, the slick ice patches. It wasn't a shortcut. It wasn't scenic. And it led nowhere the boys needed to be. Worse, it required deliberate navigation to reach multiple forks, decision points, and miles of travel with no towns in between. This raises a question investigators would wrestle with for decades. How did 5 men who hated the cold, feared the wilderness, and relied heavily on routine, end up on that mountain road? The community, stunned by the initial disappearance, began piecing together what they knew about the group's habits. They weren't impulsive. They weren't explorers. They were, in fact, the opposite: structured, predictable, and safety-conscious. Each man relied on the others for emotional confidence. They rarely made big decisions independently. Families and therapists described the group's bond as collective logic. If one was unsure, another clarified. If one was frightened, another comforted. If one had a bad idea, the others gently redirected. That harmony made their deviation even stranger. Some locals theorized they were misled by someone they trusted. Others speculated they panicked after something unexpected. But even those explanations ran into walls. The car wasn't found crashed, stuck, or out of gas. It appeared parked, purposefully, gently, almost respectfully. Inside the vehicle, investigators found programs from the basketball game. Nothing else unusual. No signs of a struggle or a third party. No mechanical failures. No evidence of disorientation. Just a car, and a dead end. As the days turned to weeks, the families endured a nightmare of uncertainty. Mothers stayed awake late at night, convinced they heard footsteps on the porch. Fathers drove every surrounding road themselves, hoping to stumble upon a clue police had missed. Community groups formed volunteer search parties, combing ravines, back roads, and rural towns. But winter in the mountains is cruel. Snow buried tracks. Wind erased evidence. And the forest grew quiet, hiding whatever secrets it held. When the spring thaw finally revealed the first body months later, that discovery reshaped everything investigators believed. It suggested the men had survived longer than anyone thought. It suggested they hadn't died the night they went missing. It suggested that, for reasons unknown, they walked deep into the wilderness instead of back toward safety. It suggested something pushed them past reason. Yet even with bodies found, one mystery remained untouched. Why did they go there in the first place? Because for men who valued routine. For men eager for a basketball tournament the next morning. For men afraid of the cold and unfamiliar places. A detour into the mountains was more than unlikely. It was unthinkable. And so, before the first body was discovered, before the first shocking clue emerged, investigators were left staring at a single abandoned car and a single impossible question. What would drive 5 men so far off course on a quiet February night? The answer, if it exists, is buried deep in the events that unfolded next. Because what investigators discovered after the snow melted would challenge every assumption they had. February 24, 1978. A Friday evening heavy with the chill of late winter. The sun dipped behind the valley as thousands of locals settled in for routine nights, dinners, TV programs, or trips into town. For the Yuba County Five, it was a night they'd been anticipating all week, the UC Davis vs. Chico State basketball game. The five friends gathered in Jack Madruga's pale green 1969 Mercury Montego. It was the only car among them, and Jack, responsible, methodical, was always the driver. They left Yuba City around 5:30 p.m., chatting excitedly, carrying snacks, and bundled lightly despite the crisp weather. They weren't worried. The game wasn't far. The roads were familiar. The group's mood was high. They loved basketball, not just watching it, but studying it, analyzing plays, replaying moves from the players they admired. And the Chico game wasn't just entertainment, it was inspiration. The next morning, they were scheduled to play in their own Special Olympics tournament. Winning meant possible entry into a championship camp in Los Angeles. By every account, family testimony, friends, therapists, this game mattered to them. Nothing in their lives suggested they would jeopardize attending the tournament the next morning. They reached Chico without incident. Witnesses confirmed seeing them at the game, laughing, clapping, enjoying the energy of the crowd. They bought snacks from a vending machine afterward. Nothing strange. Nothing tense. Nothing suggestive of the catastrophe soon to follow. When the final buzzer sounded, they walked back to the car. Time, around 10 p.m. From here, the night becomes a labyrinth of contradictions. Jack Madruga drove, as he always did. The expected route was simple, a straight shot south toward Yuba City. Well-lit main roads. No detours needed. Even in darkness, this was a familiar drive. But somewhere between Chico and home, the car took a turn. A wrong one. Maybe intentional. Maybe accidental. Maybe influenced by someone else entirely. Instead of traveling south, the Mercury Montego headed east, toward Oroville. Still not alarming, until it continued further into the foothills. Then further into the mountains. Then onto a winding, remote road where no one, especially not these five, should have been that night. Why did they go there? This single question would haunt the investigation for decades. The first potential clue came from a man named Joseph Shones, whose testimony would later become one of the most debated components of the case. That night, Shones was driving up the same mountain road to check on his cabin's snow load. His car got stuck in the snow around 11:30 p.m. Exiting the vehicle, he felt a strange, stabbing pain in his chest, later suspected to be a mild heart attack. Fighting through pain, he climbed back inside for warmth. Through his windshield, Shones claimed he saw headlamps in the distance, multiple figures, possibly a woman among them, and what looked like a baby. The scene was hazy, dim. He said he shouted for help. The group paused, then walked away into the darkness. When investigators later learned of this account, nothing about it aligned perfectly. 5 men. A woman. A baby. Walking together in a mountain forest at midnight? Was Shones hallucinating from heart trauma? Or did he truly see the Yuba County Five? Records confirm this. Shones' stuck car and the Montego were found extremely close to each other. But whether the men ignored him, or never saw him at all, remains uncertain. Before dawn, Shones recovered enough strength to walk miles down the mountain and call for help. By the time deputies reached his abandoned car the next morning, the Yuba County Five were already gone. The next verified event occurred early the following morning. A forest ranger driving the mountain road spotted the Montego. He noted it wasn't stuck. Not damaged. Not abandoned in panic. Just sitting as though placed there gently. He assumed it belonged to weekend hikers and continued on. But the boys were already missing. It wasn't until families began calling each other that panic spread. Have you seen Jack? Did Bill come home? I thought they were with you. They should have been back last night. By noon the next day, the men were officially considered missing. What followed was a massive search effort. Helicopters scanned ravines. Deputies canvassed roads. Families taped flyers to poles and storefronts. But the snow made everything difficult, covering tracks, erasing clues, hiding evidence beneath frozen layers. Meanwhile, investigators pieced together more sightings. A local woman said she saw 5 young men at a convenience store in Oroville early Saturday morning. Her account was considered credible but unconfirmed. Another witness claimed he saw them in a pickup truck. Each story was plausible, yet incompatible with the others. Could all these sightings have been mistaken identity? Or were the 5 men moving from location to location, scared and confused? Back on the mountain, investigators inspected the Montego. The keys were missing. Doors unlocked. Fuel tank nearly full. No signs of foul play. No sign the men tried to dig the vehicle out. No footprints, thanks to snowfall overnight. A ranger commented later, they could have just turned around. The road wasn't blocked. That observation became one of the most chilling elements. Inside the car. Programs from the basketball game. Snack wrappers. The men's jackets, they left without them despite freezing temperatures. Why would they leave their coats behind if they intended to walk into the night? This pattern continued with every clue. Every discovery raised a new question. And then, winter ended. In June, when the first body was found, investigators knew this wasn't simply a case of lost hikers. The distance alone, from the car to the trailer, was staggering. 20 miles through dense forest, deep snow, and freezing nights. A journey no one could explain. The men didn't simply walk away from the road. They plunged deep into the mountains, as though fleeing from something, or following someone. The chronological path of their final hours grew darker with every revelation. But nothing investigators uncovered in those early days could prepare them for what the thaw revealed next, shocking discoveries that would turn this disappearance from confusing to chilling. Because the story was about to shift from where they went to why. There is a moment in every investigation when the facts on paper stop behaving like facts. When they begin to resist, to bend, to challenge the simplest explanations. For the case of the Yuba County Five, that moment arrived when search teams pushed deeper into the Plumas National Forest and stepped into an abandoned Forest Service trailer, a discovery that instantly shattered the clean, predictable theories formed in the early days of the search. It was here that investigators realized they were dealing with something far stranger, far more unsettling, than 5 young men who simply got lost. The first twist emerged long before anyone arrived at the trailer. It came from a single, devastating measurement, the 12-mile distance between the abandoned Mercury Montego and the shelter hidden deep within the forest. 12 miles through near-freezing temperatures, snowdrifts that could swallow a man's legs, darkness that erased the horizon, and terrain that punishes even experienced outdoorsmen. The Yuba County Five were not dressed for winter conditions. They wore lightweight shirts, sneakers, no winter coats, and carried no supplies. Yet based on the tracks, drag marks, and the time window, investigators concluded unmistakably, the men walked that distance on foot. This single fact destroyed the assumption that the group panicked and immediately succumbed to the cold. Men described by family as cautious, routine-oriented, and often fearful of unfamiliar situations did something incredibly difficult. They moved deeper into the mountains, farther from home, farther from safety. They did not turn around. They did not attempt to retrace the road. They walked with direction, not confusion. And no one could explain why. When investigators finally located the trailer, a weathered Forest Service structure meant for temporary ranger use, the confusion grew tenfold. Inside, the search team expected chaos, signs of desperation, torn supplies, frantic attempts to stay warm. Instead, they found stillness, order, still-wrapped food, and used blankets stacked neatly. A propane tank sitting full outside, connected to a heating system that could have kept all 5 men alive. A locker stocked with rations designed for long-term survival. None of it had been touched. The only indication that someone had tried to create warmth was a single candle burned nearly to its base. No fire had been lit inside. The propane heater remained untouched. Matches were left in place. It was as if the men had entered the trailer, taken shelter, and then froze in a state of inaction. Even for individuals who might struggle under stress, investigators said this behavior felt unnatural. They knew what cold felt like. They understood hunger. They understood survival basics. And yet they chose not to use the very tools placed directly in front of them. Then came the discovery that ripped through the investigation with the force of a sledgehammer: the body of Ted Weiher. He lay on a bed inside the trailer, wrapped tightly in blankets. His beard had grown nearly 2 inches, enough for forensic examiners to conclude he survived between 8 and 13 weeks after the disappearance of the group. For 2 months or more, someone had cared for him, at least initially. Someone had taken the time to wrap him, perhaps to comfort him, perhaps to keep him warm. But eventually, he died alone. Outside, faint footprints indicated multiple individuals had been around the trailer. Some prints circled the clearing. Others disappeared into the woods. But there was no sign that any of the men attempted to walk back down the mountain. No attempt to retrace their original path. They reached shelter, and then stayed. It was behavior that didn't match panic. It matched expectation. Or fear. Just yards from the trailer, investigators found a small fire pit. It looked hastily built, a shallow formation of ash and charred paper. Someone had attempted to burn tiny scraps, perhaps from a book or manual, in a weak effort to create warmth. Again, nothing about this made sense. If they needed warmth, they had tools inside. If they needed food, shelves were stocked. If they needed heat, the propane tank could have kept them alive for weeks. Instead, they lit almost nothing. They chose almost nothing. And then came the most debated revelation of all, the testimony of a stranded motorist named Joseph Shones. On the night of February 24th, Shones was trapped in his vehicle on the same mountain road after suffering chest pains. For hours, he remained stuck in the snow, drifting in and out of consciousness. During this time, he claimed he saw lights, flashlights flickering along the road. He saw silhouettes, shapes of multiple men. He believed they were the same size and build as the Yuba County Five. But one detail haunted him for the rest of his life. He said he saw what looked like a woman with the group. A woman and possibly a child. Although this part of his memory shifted over time and remains heavily debated, one thing stayed consistent: he saw 5 men walking up the road, away from safety, toward the mountain. If Shones was correct, then the group wasn't wandering blindly. They were following someone. Or something. And what investigators would later find inside the trailer, near Weiher's body, hinted that he may not have been alone during his final days. The deeper investigators pushed into the Plumas National Forest, the more the facts surrounding the disappearance of the Yuba County Five stopped behaving like facts at all. Early in the investigation, officers clung to ideas that felt comforting in their simplicity. The men got lost, panicked, and succumbed to the cold. But the moment search teams located the isolated Forest Service trailer, that entire narrative began to collapse. What they found wasn't evidence of a group overtaken by nature. It was evidence of decisions, deliberate, unsettling decisions that contradicted everything their loved ones believed about them. The first fact to shatter the early theories was the distance between the abandoned Mercury Montego and the trailer. 12 miles separated the two. 12 miles of heavy snow, uneven terrain, freezing winds, and suffocating darkness. The men wore thin shirts, light jackets, and casual shoes, clothing meant for basketball, not survival. Yet evidence proved they walked every step of that punishing distance. They didn't collapse near their car. They didn't wander in circles. They moved in a straight, committed path deeper into the mountains. For a group known for their predictability, routine, and caution, this journey didn't just seem unlikely, it seemed impossible. The idea that they were simply confused no longer matched what investigators saw. Something propelled them forward. Whether that something was fear, trust, or misunderstanding, no one could say. When investigators stepped inside the Forest Service trailer, the scene stunned them even more. They expected a picture of desperation, scattered items, frantic attempts to stay warm, ransacked cabinets. Instead, they found a place that looked almost untouched. On shelves sat dozens of canned rations, enough to feed multiple people for weeks. In the corner, heavy wool blankets lay neatly stacked. Outside, a large propane tank, full and ready, was connected to a working heater that could have kept the men warm through the coldest nights. Everything they needed to survive was right there. Yet almost none of it had been used. There was no attempt to turn on the heater. No sign the blankets had been distributed. No propane used. No stockpiled food opened. The only evidence of warmth was a single burned candle. One candle in a place full of solutions. Even with the group's cognitive challenges, their families insisted these were boys who understood safety. They understood cold. They knew when to ask for help. But here, surrounded by resources, they acted as if something was stopping them from using what was right in front of them. The most heartbreaking discovery was found in a bed at the far end of the trailer. Wrapped carefully in several blankets, almost as if someone had tucked him in, was the body of 32-year-old Ted Weiher. Forensic experts noted a beard growth of nearly 2 inches, suggesting he had survived between 8 and 13 weeks after the group initially vanished. That meant at least one of the men lived for months, not days. There were also indications he had been cared for. His feet were bandaged using torn strips of fabric from his own clothing, suggesting someone tried to ease his pain. But if someone tended to him, where were they now? The others were nowhere near the trailer. They had vanished again, leaving behind no clear explanation. Outside the structure, faint footprints hinted at multiple men moving around the area. Some seemed to circle the trailer. Others veered toward the woods. None led back down the mountain. None showed any attempt to return to civilization. This was perhaps the most baffling detail. Reaching the trailer should have been the moment where they gathered their strength and turned back. Instead, they stayed. They waited. Or perhaps, they feared what might happen if they tried to leave. Evidence of a tiny, makeshift fire pit near the trailer only deepened the mystery. Someone had attempted to burn scraps of paper and wood in the snow. It was a pitiful fire, too weak to provide real warmth. Yet inside the trailer, full heating equipment sat untouched. Why attempt to build a fire outside when a functioning heater was feet away? The decision made no sense. It suggested hesitation, uncertainty, or a belief that using the trailer's resources was wrong, forbidden, or dangerous. Then came the most controversial twist, the eyewitness account of Joseph Shones. On the night of February 24th, the same night the Yuba County Five vanished, Shones became stranded in his vehicle on that same mountain road. Snow trapped his car, and suffering chest pains, he remained inside for hours. During that time, he saw movement through the trees, shapes illuminated by flashlights. Figures walking. Voices. He later insisted he saw a group of men, and possibly, a woman among them. Although the details about a woman or child shifted over time, Shones remained adamant about one thing: he saw the men walking farther up the mountain, alive, long after abandoning their car. His account contradicted the idea of confusion or panic. Instead, it suggested purpose. The men were following something, or someone. And if Shones' memory was accurate, they weren't alone in those woods. The Forest Service trailer did not bring investigators answers. It brought complications, a tangle of contradictions that forced law enforcement, forensic specialists, and psychologists to dissect every known detail of the Yuba County Five. The facts did not line up cleanly. The men's personalities, the physical evidence, the environment, the choices made and not made, each element raised a new question the moment an old one seemed close to resolution. Investigators who had expected a straightforward search now found themselves trying to understand not just what happened, but why it happened the way it did. One of the first layers of analysis focused on the group's psychological profiles. 4 of the 5 men had mild intellectual disabilities. All of them, according to family members, were creatures of habit, routine, predictable, gentle. They avoided conflict. They stayed close to home. They relied on structure and familiarity. These were not men who wandered aimlessly into the mountains by choice. And they were certainly not men who would ignore obvious survival tools, food, heat, blankets, unless something stopped them. Each family interviewed expressed the same disbelief: their sons would never voluntarily trek into the wilderness without preparation, especially at night. This psychological portrait deepened the mystery. The men were capable of independent function, yes, they held jobs, participated in sports, and managed their daily lives successfully. But they also showed marked discomfort when routines were disrupted. Some were known to become anxious or confused in unfamiliar settings. Several investigators pointed out that if the group had experienced fear, confusion, or a perceived threat, they might follow the direction of a single, trusted individual. Whether that individual was within the group or someone they encountered remains one of the case's most enduring questions. Further forensic review shifted attention back to the abandoned Mercury Montego. The car keys were never found. The vehicle was not stuck, its wheels rotated freely. The gas tank was not empty. There was no visible damage suggesting panic or reckless driving. Most eerily, the car was parked with surprising care, as if someone intentionally brought it to a stop and ensured it would not be damaged. One sheriff's deputy remarked that the car looked like its driver didn't want to hurt it. That observation aligned with the known behavior of one of the men, who was extremely protective of the Montego. But it did not explain why they stopped in the first place. Nothing about the car's condition suggested a mechanical failure or obstruction. The engine compartment showed no signs of trouble. Everything worked. If the car was functioning, why abandon it in near-freezing temperatures? This question pushed investigators to consider whether the men believed help was nearby, or whether something, or someone, led them away from the road. Forensic teams later examined the footprints leading away from the car. Although melting snow obscured many details, early reports indicated up to 5 sets of prints moving together. This suggested that, at least initially, the men stayed as a group. But as the terrain grew harsher and visibility dropped, there were no signs of panic, such as scattered footprints or evidence of running. Their movement appeared calm. Intentional. Controlled. But controlled by whom? Investigators also analyzed the weather, terrain, and altitude to better understand survival conditions. That night, temperatures in the Plumas National Forest dropped well below freezing, cold enough to cause hypothermia in under an hour. The men's clothing was inadequate for such conditions. They had no flashlights, no food, no winter supplies. The fact that they walked 12 miles under these conditions remains one of the case's most perplexing elements. Forensic specialists later commented that the group should not have survived that long without serious injury. And yet, Ted Weiher survived for up to 13 weeks, which means at some point, there must have been some degree of shelter, rationing, or assistance that investigators could not fully trace. Inside the trailer, the forensic inconsistencies multiplied. There were signs that someone had opened food cans, using a tool unfamiliar to modern investigators, but similar to how Weiher's friend, Madruga, reportedly opened cans at home. Another can showed a jagged puncture pattern consistent with a pocket knife. But the pocket knife found in the trailer belonged to the Forest Service, not the men. Did they find it inside? Did someone else bring it? These subtle details made it impossible to determine whether the whole group ever entered the trailer or whether only some of them did. Even more confusing was the fact that the men never attempted to use the propane heating system. Law enforcement officers familiar with these trailers knew that operating the heater required minimal effort. It was simple, intuitive, practical. Investigators considered whether the men feared damaging property that wasn't theirs, a behavior consistent with their rigid respect for rules. But would that instinct really outweigh the threat of freezing to death? Or did they believe someone forbade them from touching it? Law enforcement also revisited witness Joseph Schoen's testimony. His account varied slightly each time he told it, but the core elements remained stable. He saw what he believed were the 5 men that night, walking in a group, accompanied by figures he couldn't fully identify. Psychologists and investigators debated whether his heart condition or stress could have influenced his perception. But physical evidence confirmed he was indeed on the mountain road that night. And he insisted to the end of his life that he had not imagined the figures he saw. Some in law enforcement quietly entertained the theory that the men encountered someone on the mountain, someone they trusted enough to follow, or someone they feared enough not to resist. This theory gained subtle traction when considering the group's tendency to follow authority figures without question. Yet the investigation never found evidence of another vehicle, tracks, or third-party involvement. Even so, the evidence left behind in the snow suggested the men were not acting on simple impulse. Their movements were too unified. Their decisions too structured. Something shaped their journey. And yet, despite all the forensic, psychological, and environmental analysis, investigators were left with one haunting truth: every layer of the case explained a piece of the story, but no layer connected fully to the next. The facts were puzzle pieces from different boxes. The journey, the trailer, the survival attempts, the unused supplies, the footprints, the witness, the timeline, none of it interlocked cleanly. Each discovery only widened the mystery. Each answer revealed another contradiction. But the most intense part of this story, the moment investigators realized they were no longer chasing facts, but something far stranger, was still ahead. The moment that would become the emotional and investigative climax of the entire case. And that moment began with a discovery so unsettling that even veteran searchers had difficulty describing it afterward. What investigators found next in the Plumas National Forest, after months of searching, conflicting witness accounts, partial remains, and theories that grew stranger as time passed, became the emotional and investigative climax of the entire Yuba County Five case. Because this wasn't just a discovery. It was a collision point, between fear and survival, between hope and the stark reality of what these young men endured, and between what investigators believed they knew and what the evidence refused to explain. The recovery teams had already found the Forest Service trailer and Ted Weiher's body. But 4 men were still missing. And the discovery of partial evidence outside the trailer told them only one thing: the forest was not finished giving up its secrets. Search crews expanded their grid. They widened their radius, combing ravines, creek beds, and steep drops hidden under thick blankets of pine needles. Snow had melted by this stage of the investigation, revealing terrain that had been impossible to search during winter. And in early June of 1978, more than 4 months after the disappearance, the forest finally revealed the next piece of the puzzle. One of the searchers found a human bone. At first, they thought it might be an animal. But as they swept leaves aside, then dirt, then layers of detritus built up over seasons, they found more: clothing fragments, a decomposed shoe, and a spine. Dental records later confirmed the remains belonged to Jack Madruga. He was found almost 3 miles from the trailer, as if he, or someone, had attempted to leave but never made it far. The scene didn't answer the question of why he walked away. It only raised more. Several hundred yards away, searchers discovered another set of remains, reduced by animals and the elements. These remains belonged to Bill Sterling. He was close enough to Jack Madruga that investigators believe the 2 men may have traveled together until exhaustion, hypothermia, or injury overtook them. But even with these heartbreaking discoveries, the most emotionally jarring moment of the investigation was still ahead. Deep inside the forest, off the road, tangled in underbrush so dense that even trained searchers struggled to push through, lay the remains of Gary Mathias, or so investigators initially believed. They found his shoes. They found pieces of clothing. They found personal items. But the skeletal remains that investigators expected, Gary's skull, his bones, his spine, were never found. His shoes were there. His belongings were there. But his body was never recovered. And that single detail twisted the case into the realm of chilling uncertainty. How could a man's shoes and belongings be present without his remains? He hadn't been carried by animals, there was no drag path. There was no sign of burial, no sign of struggle. Just a pair of abandoned shoes, Gary's shoes, sitting in a place that suggested he had reached the area alive. But was he alive when he left those shoes behind? The discovery intensified speculation, because Gary was unlike the others physically. He was athletic, strong, and accustomed to navigating unfamiliar places. He was also the only one missing whose body was never found, creating a permanent fissure in the emotional core of the case. Families wanted closure. Investigators wanted answers. But the forest gave them only fragments, not explanations. Finally, the remains of Jackie Hewitt were found. A father and son searching the area privately, months after official teams had cleared the region, stumbled upon Hewitt's remains near a small stream, farther from the trailer than Madruga or Sterling but not as far as Mathias's abandoned shoes. Jackie's remains had also been scattered by wildlife, but personal items helped confirm his identity. By the time all recoverable remains were catalogued, investigators faced a harrowing picture. 5 young men entered the forest together, but only one made it into the trailer long enough to survive for weeks. The others seemed to have splintered off, possibly confused, possibly injured, possibly desperate. The geography told a story. But their decisions told another, one that investigators still couldn't reconcile with logic. The climactic moment of this case wasn't any single discovery. It was the dawning realization among investigators and the families that the Yuba County Five were not simply lost. Something led them deep into the mountains. Something pushed them into an environment they weren't prepared for. And something kept them from using the tools that could have saved their lives. Whether that something was internal confusion, external influence, or a chain of decisions made under panic or distress, no one knew. But the hardest truth emerged as investigators gathered evidence from across the forest floor. The group tried to survive. They tried to move. They tried to find help, even if their choices didn't make sense. Even if their movements were fractured, chaotic, or contradictory. They moved because they were still hoping for a way out. And yet, none came. The scene at the trailer was heartbreaking enough. But the scattered remains, separated across miles, turned the case from a mystery into a tragedy of enormous emotional weight. Every family had to face the reality that their sons had died alone, cold, frightened, and confused in a wilderness they never meant to be in. But the missing remains of Gary Mathias, his complete disappearance, kept the possibility of an unanswered final chapter alive. Was he the last survivor? Did he attempt to seek help? Or did something else happen after he left the trailer? The forest would not say. The story of the Yuba County Five does not end with clarity. It does not resolve into a simple chain of cause and effect. Instead, it lands in a liminal place, where facts contradict instincts, where evidence resists every explanation, and where every answer opens a door to another question. The survivors never spoke. The victims never left a message behind. The families were left with fragments, footprints, timelines, objects, sightings, and a trail of choices that felt foreign to everyone who knew the five young men. In the weeks following the recovery of the bodies, investigators reviewed every detail again. Every search log. Every mapped coordinate. Every witness account. They reconstructed the group's last known movements minute by minute. They interviewed family members, psychologists, forest rangers, and locals who lived near the mountain. Yet, even with all of that, no single narrative explained everything. Some elements aligned with misadventure. Some with fear. Some with the possibility that the men encountered someone who influenced their decisions. But none of these theories fully satisfied the questions raised by the evidence found at the trailer. Families struggled with a haunting contradiction. These were boys who stuck to routines, who avoided unfamiliar places, who showed caution and sensitivity in nearly every aspect of their lives. They feared uncertainty, not embraced it. And yet here they were, 13 miles into a mountain, far from their car, deeper into danger, moving toward isolation instead of away from it. This was not in their nature. That inconsistency became the deepest wound for the mothers and fathers who tried to understand how their sons disappeared into a forest that should never have been part of their story. In time, the official case remained classified as a tragic, unexplained misadventure aggravated by environmental exposure. But the families never fully accepted this. They believed something, or someone, played a role that investigators never uncovered. They pointed to the unused supplies in the trailer, the food the men never opened, the full propane tank they never touched, and the fact that they split up after reaching a safe shelter. None of that aligned with panic. None of that aligned with survival instinct. Some investigators privately admitted their discomfort with the case as well. It wasn't simply the distance or the conditions, it was the behavioral patterns. One man surviving almost 3 months. The others likely surviving for days or weeks before succumbing to starvation or cold. The footprints that showed purposeful movement around the trailer. The presence of one pair of heavier boots inside the shelter, boots not belonging to the boys. And perhaps most troubling, the implications of the Joseph Shones account, in which he described seeing a group of people, including, possibly, a woman, on the mountain road the night the boys disappeared. Whether Shones' details were blurred by pain, fear, or exhaustion remains debated. But investigators could never dismiss him entirely, because his sighting was consistent with the timeline. The men were on the mountain road that night. They did keep moving past the point where their car was found. They were alive for hours after leaving the Montego. That much is certain. As the years passed, theories rose and fell. Some suspected a violent encounter with an unknown person in the mountains. Some believed the group became lost while following a mistaken route. Others felt the men were coerced or misled by someone they encountered along the way. A few investigators wondered whether the men were trying to help someone, a stranger in distress, and ended up trapped by the environment. But again, no single theory resolved all the anomalies: the untouched food, the unused heat, the survival time, the distances traveled, and the decisions that contradicted everything known about the group. Every attempt at explanation left jagged edges. The families of the 5 young men carried those edges for decades. Glances at empty chairs at dinner tables. Bedrooms left undisturbed for years. Photos fading in frames. Voicemails saved long after the machines they played on stopped working. Mothers who refused to move away in case their sons returned. Fathers who searched the mountains on their own long after the case was considered closed. The tragedy became a permanent part of Yuba County's collective memory. A reminder that even in familiar places, even in tight-knit communities, even among those who live steady and predictable lives, mysteries can erupt from nowhere. The forest where the men were found remains quiet, untouched, almost sacred to those who know the story. The trailer, later removed by the Forest Service, lives on only in photographs and testimony. To this day, the final hours of the Yuba County Five remain locked in silence. Investigators cannot fully explain why the men left their car. Why they walked deeper into danger. Why they avoided life-saving supplies. Why they separated. Or why only one survived for months. It is a mosaic of contradictions, each piece factual, but together still unable to form a complete picture. Perhaps the answer lies somewhere in the snow that melted decades ago. Perhaps it lies in memories that faded before they could be recorded. Perhaps it lies with someone who passed away without realizing what they saw. Or perhaps, as some investigators quietly admit, the truth is simply unreachable. A moment lost. A decision that will never be understood. A night on a cold mountain where 5 young men walked into the darkness and never found their way back. What remains is not an ending, but an echo, a question suspended in time. In every stage of the investigation, the Yuba County Five story offered law enforcement a constant stream of questions that never fully aligned with one another. Even after years of searching, compiling reports, interviewing families, and revisiting the terrain season after season, the case refused to settle into a straightforward narrative. What emerged instead was a series of moments, threads investigators continued to pull at, each one leading not to clarity, but to a deeper layer of uncertainty. These moments, scattered across the timeline of the case, became the unwitting landmarks of a mystery that still grips people today. Even the earliest days contain questions that refuse to resolve. For example, the discovery of the Mercury Montego raised a strange contradiction that investigators would revisit again and again. The car was perfectly parked. Not slid. Not skidded. Not jammed against a snowbank. It looked as though someone who understood the mountain road placed the vehicle there intentionally. But none of the young men had experience on that terrain, nor any reason to be there. Every time detectives reviewed photographs of that car, they hit the same wall. How did it get there without damage? Who parked it so neatly? Did something happen inside that vehicle that forced them to leave it behind? These questions clung to the case like smoke that never cleared. Another moment investigators repeatedly circled back to was the strange alignment between the group's expected behavior and the impossible choices they made that night. These were men who avoided uncertainty, who followed schedules, who stuck to what they knew. The idea that they willingly traveled into unfamiliar mountains, at night, in winter, was completely at odds with their documented patterns. Each time families spoke to reporters or law enforcement, they repeated the same sentiment: they would not do this. Not together, not on purpose. And every time those words resurfaced, they reopened the same possibility investigators could never eliminate, that someone else may have influenced their actions that night. Then there was the trailer, the only structure for miles, and the haunting contradictions it held. Investigators kept returning to the untouched propane tank, the unused heating system, and the sealed food rations. These elements made the trailer feel less like a place where the men found safety and more like a place where they hesitated, unsure of what they could or should do. Even the careful way Ted Weiher was wrapped in blankets raised unsettling questions. Who tended to him? How long were they together? Why did only one man remain in the trailer while the others vanished into the forest? Each of these details became an anchor point in the investigation, moments detectives would highlight during briefings, returning to them whenever the case seemed to demand a new angle. Even years later, the Joseph Shones sighting remained one of the most revisited threads. He described figures moving in the dark, figures he believed to be the missing men, and possibly others. Investigators interviewed him multiple times, hoping repetition would spark clarity. But each retelling only reintroduced the same dilemma. Shones was certain he saw them, yet his account introduced new mysteries rather than solving existing ones. Were the men alone? Were they following someone? Did Shones misinterpret what he saw, or did that detail point to something far more complex? No matter how many times investigators attempted to fit his sighting into the timeline, it never fit neatly. It always created more questions than answers. And every time Shones's name resurfaced in the file, detectives were forced to confront the lingering possibility that someone else had been on that mountain road. As time went on and more bodies were discovered, these unresolved threads intertwined, creating a narrative that became more tangled, not less. Every discovery opened a door that led to another corridor of unknowns. The men who were found offered partial insights, but their locations, conditions, and distances from one another only compounded the mystery. Why were they separated? Why was one so far from the trailer? Why did their paths splinter off in different directions? Each recovery added a clue, but every clue produced a new contradiction. It was as though the case wanted to remain unsolved, offering just enough information to draw investigators in, but never enough to let them reach the end. And years later, when families revisited the places their loved ones were found, reporters often noted the same heavy question hanging in the air: were they running from something, or to something? This question lingered not just in official records but in the collective consciousness of the communities surrounding Yuba County. It became the unresolved heartbeat of the case. Every major moment investigators returned to, every contradiction, every unanswered question, became part of the lasting structure of the mystery. These threads, pulled repeatedly yet never fully unraveling, are the reason the story remains so gripping decades later. The deeper investigators dug, the more those unresolved elements pulled them back, reminding them that the case was not finished. Not then. Not now. And perhaps not ever. The story of the Yuba County Five remains one of the most agonizing mysteries in American criminal history, a puzzle of footprints, fear, survival, and silence. Decades later, the questions still echo across the Plumas National Forest. 5 men walked into the snow. Only one of them survived for weeks. And none of them made it home. Was it confusion? Was it fear? Was it a wrong turn that spiraled into tragedy? Or something, or someone, they encountered along the way? Even now, investigators, families, journalists, and armchair sleuths continue searching for the missing pieces. Each theory adds a layer. Each revelation deepens the mystery. Each newly discovered detail only reinforces one truth. This case is far from simple, and far from solved. And perhaps that's why the story lingers, not just in police files, but in the minds of everyone who hears it. Because these men weren't criminals. They weren't thrill seekers. They weren't running from something or chasing danger. They were friends. They had plans the next morning. They had families waiting at home. They had lives ahead of them. And overnight, everything changed. If you found this deep dive compelling, if you believe cases like this deserve a voice, and if you want to help keep these stories alive, make sure to like this video, share it with others who follow true crime, and subscribe so you never miss our next investigation. In the comments below, tell us your theory. What do you think happened in the mountains that night? Your insights, your questions, and your curiosity drive the conversations that keep these mysteries from fading into history. And if you want to continue this journey, our next video is already live. The Dyatlov Pass Incident, 9 hikers, 0 answers. Another cold weather mystery. Another group disappearance. Another case where evidence defies reason. Click the link on screen, and we'll meet you there, where the snow holds secrets, and the truth is always colder than we expect.